He saw the children first. 3 small figures in matching yellow rain boots, crouched over something in the gravel near a park bench. Close enough to the path that Victor Caruso had to adjust his stride to avoid stepping on one of them. He glanced down the way any adult would, just checking, the way you do. And in that single second, as his eyes moved from the boots up to the woman sitting on the bench beside them, something in the back of his mind went quiet. Not calm, just very, very still. He kept walking. His face didn't change. His pace didn't change. Beside him, Elena was talking about a wedding venue in Connecticut, and the light was sitting gold on the river. And the morning had the feel of something almost deliberately peaceful. Clean air, geese on the water, in the smell of roasted chestnuts drifting from a cart somewhere behind them. This was supposed to be a simple walk. That was all it was supposed to be. And then the woman on the bench turned her head. Victor saw her face, and for the first time in 20 years, a man who had built his entire life around knowing things before other people did, found himself standing inside a fact he had not seen coming. Her name was Marisa, and sitting beside her in yellow rain boots were 3 children who couldn't have been more than 3 years old. 3 children who looked back at him in the cold October light with a set of features. He spent the next several seconds trying to argue himself out of recognizing. He couldn't argue himself out of it. Before we go any further, before we follow what happened next, and before everything Victor discovered that morning starts to settle, stay with a few questions, because this isn't just a story about a man running into someone he used to know. It's the story of what one woman decided to do alone when telling the truth felt like handing someone a weapon. It's about what happens when a powerful man's biggest blind spot turns out to have 3 small faces and matching rain boots. Why had Marisa disappeared from his world 4 years earlier without a single word? What had she overheard that made leaving feel like the only way out? What had she been carrying across 3 cities and 4 years? And what would a man like Victor, a man whose whole reputation was built on knowing everything first, actually do when he realized he had known nothing at all? Those questions are at the center of everything that follows. Hold on to them. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We genuinely love hearing from you. And if you're new here, click subscribe so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. To understand what that October morning cost, you have to understand the 6 years that led to it. You have to understand what Costello's was, what it meant to work there, and who Victor Caruso was before Elena arrived in his life and before the silver came in at his temples. You have to go back 7 years to a Tuesday evening in late autumn, when a 27-year-old woman named Marisa Vega walked into a job interview at a private dining room on the Upper East Side, wearing her best blazer and a resume that quietly understated how sharp she was. She had learned, through experience, that certain employers found that quality inconvenient. Costello's was technically a restaurant. Ground floor of a limestone townhouse on a quiet block. 12 tables. No sign out front except the building number in brushed brass. And you needed a referral to even get a reservation. The chef was genuinely good. The wine list was genuinely serious. And the owner, a real estate developer named Harold Fitch, had nothing to do with organized crime. Harold Fitch was just a man with expensive taste and poor judgment in hiring, who had brought on a floor manager named Denny Altieri without adequately looking into who Denny's associates were. Within 18 months, Costello's had become what certain people called a soft room, a place where specific men had specific conversations, where serious business got worked through over meals nice enough to make the whole thing feel almost normal. Harold Fitch was rarely there. Denny ran the floor, and the servers understood without being told what the job actually required: to be invisible, to pour wine without making eye contact, to clear a plate without hearing what was said over it, to smile politely at a direct question and then disappear back through the kitchen door. Marisa Vega was very good at this. She'd grown up in a house where reading a room wasn't a social skill. It was something you learned because the alternative was worse. Her father wasn't a violent man, but he was an unpredictable one. And from her mother, she'd inherited a particular kind of quiet attentiveness. The ability to absorb what was happening around her and file it away without reacting. She'd started a communications degree at a state college before the money ran out, worked 3 jobs to pay off debt, and arrived at Costello's at 27 with a composure that Denny Altieri recognized in the first 10 minutes of her interview as exactly what the room needed. She got the job. She was good at it. 4 nights a week, she served powerful men their osso buco and aged Barolo, smiled without really listening, learned every preference before it had to be stated, and rode the express train home to the Bronx with her face deliberately blank until she was through her own front door. Victor Caruso came in most Tuesday and Thursday evenings, always with 2 or 3 other men, always the corner table near the window, always the branzino if it was available, the rack of lamb if it wasn't, and always a specific bottle of Barolo that Denny kept in reserve just for him. He tipped well and without ceremony. He said thank you and meant it, which, in that room, was not a given. Marisa served his table for 3 years. She learned his preferences the way you learn any regular clients, practically, without getting personal. Second breadbasket without being asked, coffee after dessert with 1 sugar, no milk. When his hand moved very slightly on the tablecloth, he wanted the check. She did not think of him as a person. She did not let herself. And yet, and this was the detail she couldn't quite file away cleanly, whenever something at that corner table grew tense, whenever the conversation went low and concentrated the way it did when something serious was being decided, Victor Caruso was the stillest person in the room. Not performing calm, just still. The way a man is still when stillness is the most powerful thing he has. She noticed it. She told herself it meant nothing. She went home. She slept fine. For about a year, that was completely true. Then, sometime in her 2nd year at Costello's, something shifted. Small and unremarkable, the way the things that change everything usually are. Victor arrived one Thursday evening alone. No associates, no briefcase. He ordered the lamb. And for the entire meal, he sat with his hands folded on the tablecloth and stared at nothing in the way of a man who has just been handed information that requires him to rethink something he believed was settled. He barely touched his food. He didn't look at his phone once. When Marisa brought the dessert coffee, he looked up, not past her, not through her, but at her, and said, "What's your name?" She told him. He nodded slowly, a nod with some weight behind it she couldn't immediately place, and said, "Marisa, thank you." He left his usual tip, put on his coat, and walked out. Such a small thing. She turned it over on the train home and was annoyed at herself for turning it over. Men at Costello's asked you your name all the time, and it rarely meant anything good. But the way he'd asked, without performance, no agenda in it, like he just actually wanted to know, stayed with her in a way she found irritating and couldn't quite shake. Over the next few months, Victor began to talk to her. Short exchanges, a question about the catch of the day, A comment about the weather when she brought his coat. Once, he noticed a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt she'd left visible in her jacket pocket in the break room. He could see it from his table, which she hadn't realized, and he said, "Good book." She'd said, "How would you know?" before she could stop herself. He'd looked at her with an expression that started as startled, and then slowly became something like genuine amusement. He said, "I read it. 12 years ago. She was harder than most people give her credit for." He left before she had a chance to say anything back. She stayed up too late that night going over it. And the fact that she stayed up too late was itself the thing she'd been trying not to look at. She told herself it was nothing. She was wrong, and she knew it. And she kept telling herself anyway. Because that's what people do. Hold a door shut with both hands while understanding, somewhere underneath, that what's on the other side has already started to change the shape of the room. What you need to know about the months that followed is that nothing dramatic happened. That was part of what made it so hard to name. There was no single moment Marisa could look back on and say, "That's where I made the mistake." There were evenings she stayed a little longer than her shift required. Conversations that should have ended at the wine list that went a little further. An evening when she told him something about her mother and he listened the way he listened to everything. Completely. Without interruption. Like what she was saying was the only thing happening in the world. She knew exactly what kind of man he was. She wasn't naive about it. Over 2 years of Tuesdays and Thursdays, she had absorbed enough fragments from that corner table to understand, in general terms, what the business there involved. She didn't want specifics, but she wasn't under any illusion that the man who asked about her book and tipped well was just someone who liked good lamb. She knew what he was. She held that knowledge alongside the other thing, the warmer, more complicated thing, and told herself they were incompatible. And she was right, and she kept going anyway. By the time she was honest with herself about what had developed, she was deep enough into it that honesty felt like standing at the edge of a drop. There was no good version of the next step. There never had been. And here, before we get to what happened next, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you already knew the answer, where the facts were all right there, but you kept moving forward anyway, because stopping felt more impossible than continuing? And because that was exactly where Marisa Vega was. And what was about to happen was going to cost her more than she had prepared for. The thing that ended it, the first real turning point, not the one in the park but the earlier one, the one that set everything else in motion, happened on an otherwise unremarkable Thursday evening in November, 4.5 years before that October morning in Riverside Park. One of the other servers had called in sick. Denny pulled Marisa aside and told her she'd be covering 2 tables for the rest of the night. She said yes and went back out. At around 9:15, carrying a bread basket to the table next to Victor's, she heard, not a fragment, not something half-implied, but a clear and specific sentence spoken at a volume that assumed the adjacent table was empty. That described, one without any ambiguity, what was planned for a specific person on a specific night. She did not stop walking. She did not change her expression. She set the bread basket down and walked back to the kitchen at exactly the same pace she'd walked out. She went to the supply room, sat down on an upturned crate, and spent 2 minutes just breathing. Then she smoothed her uniform, went back to the floor, and worked the rest of the service without a single mistake. She took the train home. She sat on her couch in the dark for a long time. She did not sleep. What do you do with that? What do you do when something lands on you that you didn't ask for, that you can't unknow, and that is connected, directly, To someone you have spent months trying to convince yourself you don't care about? She didn't call the police. Not that night. Not in the first 24 hours. She went to work the next 2 evenings. She poured the wine and folded the napkins and was, by every available measure, the same Marisa Vega she had always been. On the 3rd day, she called in sick. On the 4th day, she called Denny and said there was a family emergency and she needed 2 weeks. He said he'd cover her shifts. She hung up and looked around her apartment and understood, clearly and without drama, that she needed to think carefully about what she was going to do with the rest of her life. She was 29 years old. She had $400 in her checking account. A sister in Phoenix who knew nothing about where Marisa worked or who she served. And something else. Something she'd been trying not to think about for 3 weeks now. Something that was becoming impossible to keep ignoring. Something that took the already impossible situation and made it feel genuinely unsurvivable. She was pregnant. She didn't know yet that she was carrying 3. That came 5 weeks later at a clinic in the Bronx on a Tuesday morning when the ultrasound technician, a steady woman named Greta who had clearly given this kind of news before, said very calmly, "I'm seeing 3 heartbeats, honey. You're going to want to take a moment." Marisa had taken considerably more than a moment. She drove home in her friend Tamara's borrowed car and sat outside her building for 45 minutes before she trusted herself to go inside. 3. She had barely been managing the reality of 1, which had already felt like standing at the edge of a ledge. 3 was the ledge giving way. There's something important to say here, because Marisa Vega deserves more than to be flattened into a symbol. She was a real person in a situation with no clean exits. She had made choices, had let something professional become something more, had responded to something in Victor she recognized as genuine, even while understanding what surrounded it. She was not a fool. She was not a victim. She was a 29-year-old woman who had fallen into something she'd told herself she wouldn't fall into, who was now carrying the consequence of that in her body, alone and afraid, making decisions under conditions that would have broken a lot of people far more completely than they broke her. She considered every option. She thought about what telling him would mean. She thought about that sentence she'd heard at the corner table. She thought about the women she'd observed over 3 years at those dinners, well-dressed, well-provided for, the man with a specific look behind their eyes that she had filed away and never wanted to see in her own mirror. She thought about her sister in Phoenix. She thought about what actually disappearing looked like. Not dramatic, not a statement, just a practical and quiet calculation. The only one that protected 3 people who couldn't yet speak for themselves. She called Denny and told him she wasn't coming back. No explanation given. Denny wasn't surprised. People left that world all the time, and the ones who left quietly were generally the smart ones. She heard nothing from Victor. She hadn't expected to. She'd given no indication in her last weeks at Costello's that anything had changed. She was the professional to the end. The invisible presence. The woman who anticipated what you needed before you asked. And she was gone before anyone registered she'd left. She would understand later that this had been both her greatest strength and the loneliest thing she had ever done. She moved to Carmen's apartment in Phoenix, worked remotely doing healthcare data entry for 8 months, until the pregnancy made remote work impractical, and then impossible. Carmen was 24 and working nights at a hotel, and was in no way prepared to be the full support system for a woman carrying triplets. But she was willing. And in that stretch of time, willingness was what mattered most. The girls arrived in July, Lucia, Paloma, and Rosa, 6 weeks early, small and furious, with lungs the NICU staff noted were operating at full capacity. Marisa spent 11 days at the hospital and did not sleep more than 2 consecutive hours for the first 4 months of their lives. She discovered things about herself that nothing before had prepared her for. A fierceness of love she hadn't known she had. A capacity to survive on almost nothing. Almost no sleep. Almost no money. Almost no certainty about what came next. As long as 3 small people were breathing and fed and warm. She also discovered slowly that disappearing was harder than she'd expected. Not because Victor had come looking, she had no evidence of that, but because the world shrinks when you're a single mother of triplets on a remote income, and Phoenix gave way after 13 months to Albuquerque where the rent was lower, and then a nonprofit job in New York arrived with real pay and work that meant something. The city is large. 4 years is a long time. She had built a life in Queens that felt completely separate from the old one. She told herself the distance was enough. She had been careful. She had been methodical. What she hadn't fully calculated was that 3-year-olds in matching yellow rain boots on a sunny morning tend to make their mothers stay a little longer at the playground because one of them wants to see the geese, because the bench in the sun is warmer than the one in the shade. She'd been in Riverside Park that morning because Lucia asked to see geese. 4 years, 3 cities, and all of it came down to a request about geese. That's the particular cruelty of coincidence. It doesn't need a mistake. It just needs a moment. Victor's pace hadn't changed when he saw her face. That's what 2 decades of discipline does. The visible tells disappear. And what's left is a stillness the people closest to him have learned to read, not by what he shows, but by what suddenly goes quiet. His breathing shifted. His jaw settled. His hands, inside his coat pockets, curled slowly into fists. But he kept walking. He said something to Elena that made her laugh and squeeze his arm. He looked at what he was looking at and processed it the way he processed everything, quickly, thoroughly, without letting the result show on his face. 3 children, all approximately the same age. Marisa had left Costello's when. He knew exactly when. He remembered because he'd spent the weeks after she'd gone noticing her absence in a way that was disproportionate and that he'd refused to examine closely. He had asked Denny once, only once, if she'd left a number. Denny said no. Victor didn't ask again, but he'd kept the file, the specific completeness of her disappearance, the way she had simply ceased to exist in his vicinity. He had kept that door closed in the back of his mind, the way you keep a door closed not because you've forgotten it's there, but because you've decided, for now, that you'd rather not know. He was about to find out. 3 small children, approximately 3 years old, in matching yellow rain boots. His chest was doing something complicated. Victor? That was Elena's voice. Quiet, careful. The tone she used when she'd noticed something shift. "You've gone very quiet," he said. "I'm fine. I think I know someone over there." Elena looked toward the bench. "Do you want to say hello?" He didn't answer right away. He watched one of the children, the one nearest the edge of the path, catch her heel on a root and sit down hard in the gravel with a small, surprised sound. And Marisa was off the bench in under a second, one hand reaching out, her mouth already forming a name, Rosa. The child looked up with that specific toddler expression, the one where laughter and outrage are briefly negotiating, and chose laughter and held her arms up. Marisa lifted her onto her hip in one easy, practiced motion. 3 years of that exact motion, at minimum. Victor calculated this the way he calculated everything, quickly, precisely, and without giving himself the mercy of uncertainty. He started walking toward the bench. If this story has you gripped, and I have a feeling it does, go ahead and comment, I'm still watching. Let's see who's with us all the way to the end. Marisa saw him when he was about 15 feet away. He watched her see him. He watched the color leave her face in the particular controlled way of someone who has, in some private part of themselves, already rehearsed this exact moment, has imagined it and filed it away as unlikely, and who is now discovering that unlikely and impossible are not the same thing. She didn't run. He had wondered, in the 10 seconds it took him to close the distance, whether she would. She didn't. She stood with Rosa on her hip and her spine straight and her eyes steady on him. He could see in her face all of the last 4 years. Not staged, not theatrical, just the way time settles into someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time. The other 2 girls had looked up from whatever they'd been excavating in the gravel and were watching him with the open, unfiltered curiosity of children who haven't yet learned to hide what they feel. He stopped a few feet from her. Elena had paused back at a respectful distance. Further back, Roy had risen from his bench with the quiet alertness of a man still deciding whether this was a problem. Marisa, Victor said. Just her name. Level voice. She looked at his eyes. Not his coat, not his hands, not the space behind him. His eyes. With the same directness that had surprised him years ago when she'd said, "How would you know?" about an Eleanor Roosevelt biography. She said, "Hello, Victor." Steady. He thought it cost her something to keep it that way. He said quietly, "How old are they?" She held his gaze for 3 seconds that felt longer than 3 seconds. Then she said, 3. They'll be 4 in July. He did the arithmetic he'd already done, confirmed the answer he'd already arrived at. He breathed, carefully, through the weight of it. Rosa was still on her mother's hip, studying him with the focused attention of a small scientist encountering something new. She reached one hand out, unhurried, curious, and touched the lapel of his charcoal coat. Just touched it, and announced, with the complete certainty of a 3-year-old stating an obvious fact, "Coat." He looked at this small person with his jawline, rendered in miniature, his broad forehead scaled down, his own dark eyes, looking back at him from a face that was also unmistakably Marisa's, the shape of her mouth, in the way her brows sat, but with features that, together, didn't look like a stranger's child. They looked like someone he would have known anywhere, at any age, in any light. He felt something open in his chest. Not dramatic, not a flood. More like the first crack in a wall that has been sealed so long it stopped registering as a wall and started registering as a room. He knew, the moment it happened, that it wasn't going to close. "They're mine," he said. It wasn't a question. Marisa looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. Silence. Then, "Why didn't you tell me?" And from her, with a precision that was neither cruel nor soft, but just exact, "Because I knew what your world was, and I knew what it would do to them." He had no answer to that. She was right. They both knew she was right. They stood with that knowledge between them in the October air while 3 3-year-old girls played in the gravel at their feet, completely unaware of what their existence had just cost the space between 2 people who barely knew how to be in the same sentence. Elena arrived at his side. She had done the arithmetic too. Her hand found his arm. Her face was composed in the way he had learned, over 3 years, meant she was doing real work to hold it together. She said, very quietly, "Victor." He covered her hand with his. I need a moment, he said. She stepped back. She didn't go far. What happened in the next 30 minutes didn't happen in one conversation. It never does. Not with anything that actually matters. Victor asked Marisa if she would sit. Not as a man accustomed to giving directions, as someone asking, carefully, for permission. She sat. He stayed standing. His hands were out of his pockets now. The composure was showing its first real cracks. The girls had gone back to their gravel investigation. The smallest, he thought it was Lucia, because she had Marisa's face most directly, had found a pebble she liked and was holding it up toward the light with the expression of someone who has made a discovery worth sharing. He watched her do this. He felt the crack in his chest go a little wider. He told Marisa he wasn't angry. She told him she hadn't asked for his emotional assessment. He almost smiled at that. Almost? Because underneath the almost smile was something that couldn't quite land on a name. Something that moved between grief and something older and less clean that he'd need to sit with later in private. He told her he wanted to talk, properly. Not here, not standing in a park. She told him she'd spent 4 years managing 3 children without help from anyone, and that she wasn't asking for his understanding, but that she wasn't afraid of a conversation either. He said, "You raised them alone." She said yes. He said, "All 3 of them. Alone." She said, "With my sister's help at the beginning, but yes." A pause. Then he said, "I'm sorry." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not warm, not hostile, just careful, like someone deciding how much a thing actually weighs. She said, "That's not nothing." And in the flat October light, with 3 toddlers in yellow boots between them, it was the most honest exchange either of them had had in a very long time. He gave her his personal number. Not one of the business numbers, not the ones Roy managed, but the direct line, the same one Elena had. Marisa looked at it, looked at him, and put it in her pocket. He understood as he watched her do it that she wasn't going to rush, that any pressure from him would make her disappear again in ways that would be much harder to undo, and that patience was the only real option available. He was not historically a patient man. He was someone who moved fast and decided quickly and treated hesitation as a kind of failure. But the 3 small people currently excavating Riverside Park gravel had rearranged something in him that sat below the level of habit. And as he walked back to Elena, as she took his arm with that particular gentleness of someone who understands you're holding something fragile, he understood that whatever came next was not going to look like anything that had come before. Elena didn't ask questions on the walk back. She just let the silence do what silence does when someone needs it. They got coffee from the cart at the south end of the park and found a bench by the water. She held her cup in both hands and looked at the river. Eventually she said, simply, "Tell me." He told her the shape of it, Costello's, Marisa, the timeline, the arithmetic. The feeling in his chest he didn't have a word for. Elena listened the way she always listened, like the listening itself was the whole act. When he finished, she was quiet a moment. Then, "Those are your daughters?" He said yes. "All 3 of them?" "Yes." She put her coffee down and pressed her hand over her face for a few seconds. When she lowered it, her eyes were bright, but her voice was steady. She said, "Okay." He said, "Okay?" She said, "Give me 24 hours, and then we figure out what's right for those girls." He looked at her. He said, "You're a remarkable person." She picked up her coffee. She said, "I know. Drink yours before it gets cold." 3 days after the park, Victor drove himself to see his civil attorney, Hoffman. No Roy. He sat down and told the full story, beginning to end. Costello's, Marisa, the children, the timeline, what he wanted the outcome to look like. Hoffman listened, asked 3 questions, then said, "You're not on a single birth certificate. Legally, you're a stranger to these children." Victor said he knew. Hoffman said, "And you understand you can't compel her cooperation in any direction." Victor said he knew that too. Hoffman said, "Then what do you want?" Victor thought about it for a moment and said, "I want them to have a better life than I can give them if they stay inside my world." Hoffman looked at him over his reading glasses with the expression of a man who had been waiting for roughly this conversation for a decade. He said, "That's a good answer." Victor said, "It's the only honest one." That evening he called Marisa. She picked up on the 4th ring. He could hear in the background the sound of 3 small people fighting sleep. The specific overlapping negotiation of children who are exhausted and absolutely certain they are not. He said, "I'm not calling to make demands. I want to find a way to be present for them that doesn't put them in danger." A silence. Then, "Doesn't put them in your world?" He said, "Exactly." She said, "That's going to take some working out." He said he was good at working things out. She said, "Victor, are you actually going to change anything? Or are you going to show up for them the same way you show up for everything? One eye on the door, one eye on the problem?" He held the phone and let that land. He said, "I don't know yet. I'm trying to be honest with you." She said, "That's different." He said, "I know." She said, "Call me Friday." She hung up. What he hadn't told her, what he hadn't told anyone, was what he'd been sitting with all day. He stayed in his apartment in the dark with his phone in his hands and thought about a conversation he'd had 7 years ago with a priest named Father Amadeo at the church near his mother's old neighborhood. He'd gone there under the pretense of discussing a donation to the building fund. It had become, over 90 minutes, something else entirely. Father Amadeo was small and direct, and had grown up 3 blocks from Victor and had never been particularly impressed by his reputation in any direction. He had said, at the end of that conversation, "The question isn't whether you're capable of good things, Victor. You know you are. The question is whether you're willing to pay the cost of them." Victor had left that day telling himself he'd think about it. He had, for 7 years, thought about it consistently and done nothing about it. Now he sat with it again, not as a philosophical question, as something with a specific and visible price tag, one that required him to give up things he had spent 26 years building. He thought about what would have to change, and what it would cost, and who would be angry. He thought about Roy. He thought about all of it. And then, underneath all of it, he thought about Rosa touching his coat lapel, about Lucia holding that pebble toward the light, about Paloma, the quietest one, who hadn't looked at him at all at the park, but had watched her mother's face the whole time, reading it for information about whether the stranger was safe. He thought about what it meant that a 3-year-old had already mastered that particular skill. He thought about where she had learned it. He picked up his phone, scrolled to a number he hadn't contacted in 5 years. A man named Warren Cutler, a federal prosecutor who had 5 years ago extended a quiet and unofficial offer that Victor had dismissed without a second thought. He typed, "Still have the same offer on the table?" Set the phone down, went to bed, didn't sleep particularly well. At 7 in the morning, the reply read, "Always did. Call me Monday." He read it twice, set the phone face down, got up, stood at the window with his coffee, watched the city wake up below him. He was 48 years old. He had spent more than half his life building something he was now preparing, carefully and deliberately, to take apart. He was afraid. He wasn't going to pretend he wasn't. But underneath the fear, there was something that didn't have a clean name. Something that felt, for the first time in a long while, like it actually belonged to him. He texted Elena, "Awake. Come have coffee with me." She replied, "5 minutes." He stood at the window and waited. What followed Warren Cutler's reply wasn't dramatic. That's the honest thing to say about cooperation agreements. They're exhausting and legally complicated, and they happen mostly in fluorescent-lit offices, where men in suits ask the same questions many different ways. They involve months of maintaining the appearance of ordinary life, while everything inside is something else entirely. They involve real risk, real doubt. Moments when a man genuinely wonders whether he's being brave or just reckless, whether the future he's reaching for actually exists or is a story he's been telling himself. Victor Caruso spent 14 months in that process. He came out of it thinner and quieter, with a different kind of directness in his eyes than the calculation that had always been there before. Less managed, more his. Elena was with him through most of it. Not in every room, not at every meeting, but present in the way that actually matters. In the 24 hours after the park, she had told him plainly, "I'm going to be here for this. All of it. Not because it's easy, because I love you, and because those girls deserve a father who isn't a ghost." He had said, "You didn't ask for any of this." She had said, "No, but I'm choosing it. There's a difference." He had thought about Father Amadeo's question again, about the cost of good things, and understood, maybe for the first time, that part of what the question was really asking was whether he could accept other people choosing to share the cost, that letting them wasn't weakness, that it was, in its own way, harder than going it alone. But there was a complication he hadn't seen coming. Yes, about 4 months into the cooperation process, on a Thursday evening when things had started to feel like they might actually hold, Marisa called him on an unscheduled day. Her voice had the careful flatness she used when she was containing something larger than she intended to show. She said, "Someone came to my building." A man. He hadn't spoken to her but had been in the lobby asking her neighbor questions about who lived on the 3rd floor. She didn't know if it was connected to Victor or something else. She didn't raise her voice, but underneath the flatness he could hear the specific fear of a woman who has built something carefully from almost nothing and is now standing in front of it with her hands spread out. He said, "I'm going to fix this." She said, "Victor, I don't need it fixed, and I need to know my daughters are safe." There was a difference between those two things. She knew he understood the difference. The silence between them confirmed it. He called Warren Cutler the next morning. Cutler made some calls. It turned out to be nothing. A building management issue, someone checking on a lease dispute 2 floors up. A coincidence. But Victor sat with the near miss for several days, and what it made clear to him was this. The girls' safety wasn't an abstract goal. It was a specific and ongoing thing, and the process he was in the middle of was the only real foundation for it. He pushed harder, cooperated more completely than he'd originally planned, told Cutler things he'd been holding back, not because they'd been asked for, but because he'd run the calculation and understood that holding anything back was just a slower version of the same risk. He paid a higher cost than he had intended to. It was the right thing to do. It was also terrifying. Both of those things were true at the same time, and he had stopped expecting otherwise. The process concluded in the spring, 14 months after he'd texted Warren Cutler. The legal outcome isn't the point of this story, so it stays vague. What matters is that Victor Caruso was not a free man in the sense of a man without consequences. There were conditions on his future. Men who felt betrayed. Men who were angry in ways that required him to be careful, for a while, about where he went and when. Roy had made different choices, and Victor respected the clarity of that even as it cost him something. At the architecture he'd spent 26 years building was gone. In its place was something smaller and quieter. He wasn't certain yet, but he was starting to believe it was more genuinely his than anything that had come before. He and Elena were married in the spring. Small ceremony at the Garden Terrace in Connecticut, the same venue Elena had been describing on the morning of the park walk. 14 guests. The chef she liked. Geese on the river. Different geese on a different river. But still. He thought about that during the ceremony and felt something that wasn't quite funny and wasn't quite sad, but lived somewhere in between. Marisa wasn't there. They weren't in a place yet where that would have been comfortable for anyone, and honesty about where you actually are matters more than the appearance of a clean resolution. But 2 weeks after the wedding, Marisa brought the girls to a park in Queens, and Elena came, and the 4 adults, Victor, Elena, Marisa, and Carmen, who had come from Phoenix for the week, sat on a blanket in the early May sunshine, while 3 4-year-old girls in grass-stained clothes attempted to teach Elena how to do a proper forward roll. Elena had grown up without siblings, without pets, without any frame of reference for this at all. She was a diligent student. She got grass stains on her clothes. Lucia pronounced her technique pretty good, in the specific tone of a 4-year-old being generous. Victor sat a little apart, elbows on his knees, coffee going cold beside him, and thought about the path of steps that had led from a corner table at Costello's to this particular patch of Queen's lawn. Each one costing something, each one unavoidable once the one before it had been taken. Here's what a person starts to understand. Slowly, once a life built on difficult things begins to come down, that rebuilding is harder than building was. The first time around, you're young and ambitious, and failure costs less. Rebuilding, you're 49. Every choice you make sits on top of every choice that came before it. The materials are the actual truth of who you are, not the version you spent years presenting. Victor was learning this in real time. He made mistakes. He said the wrong things. Retreated into the old silence when the moment required honesty. Showed up at Marisa's apartment for early visits with the controlled bearing of a man running a meeting, when what the situation needed was just a person sitting down on a floor to read a picture book. He got better at it. Slowly. Due with the particular embarrassment of learning at 49 what most people figure out in their 20s, that being present is not the same as being there, and that children feel the difference most acutely. He took Lucia, Paloma, and Rosa to a museum on a rainy Sunday in July, their 4th birthday, and pushed a stroller through the dinosaur exhibit while 3 4-year-olds argued with genuine conviction about which dinosaur was definitively the best. He voted for the T-Rex. They formed an immediate coalition against him and dismissed his position unanimously. He called Hoffman afterward and said, "They're extraordinary." Hoffman had met them the month before at a family gathering. He said, "Yes, they really are." Victor said, "I missed 4 years." Hoffman said, "You have the rest of their lives." Victor said, "I know, and I'm working on being okay with that." Hoffman said, "Keep working." Victor said, "Yeah." He meant it. Marisa found her own version of forward on her own timeline. She enrolled in an online degree program, communications, the same thing she'd left unfinished at 19, taking classes at night after the girls were asleep. She told Victor in a co-parenting call one November that she wasn't doing it for the credential. She needed to finish something for herself, and that felt true in a way a lot of other things hadn't for a while. He said he understood. He didn't entirely, but he'd gotten better at sitting with what he didn't understand, rather than needing it to resolve on his schedule. Carmen came back from Phoenix for the winter and stayed, sleeping on Marisa's couch, with the cheerful determination of a younger sister who had finally. She grasped the full weight of what her older sister had carried alone for 4 years and quietly decided she was done being somewhere else. Marisa told Victor about Carmen staying. He said, "I'm glad she's there." He meant it. And then there was the afternoon in May when Paloma came and sat beside him without being invited. She just walked over and sat down. No explanation, the way kids make those decisions, following something internal they don't think to question. She had the most serious face of the three, the one who watched before she spoke. The one who, at the park in October, had spent the whole encounter not looking at Victor, but watching her mother's face, checking it for information about whether the stranger was safe. She sat beside him now and watched Elena doing forward rolls badly for the entertainment of Lucia and Rosa. Then she looked at him and said, "Are you happy?" He looked at this 4-year-old with his forehead and Marisa's dark eyes, asking, without any apparent awareness of how precisely she'd aimed, the most exact question available. He said, "I think I'm starting to be." She considered that for a moment with the seriousness it deserved. Then she got up and ran back to her sisters. He watched her go. The crack in his chest that had opened in October was still there. He didn't expect it to close anymore. It had changed, though. It wasn't only fracture now. It was more like the kind of opening that lets light in. Father Amadeo came up once more, unexpectedly, in the winter. Victor had been in the old neighborhood for a legal appointment, walked past the church, kicked and went in. The way you go into a place when something in you is looking for a particular kind of quiet and has run out of other places to find it. Father Amadeo was in the back of the nave reorganizing donation boxes, and looked up when Victor came in without showing any particular surprise, which Victor found familiar and oddly settling. They sat in a pew for an hour. Victor told him the broad shape of it, the park, the girls, the cooperation, the marriage, the slow work of rebuilding. Father Amadeo listened with his hands folded, and at the end said, "How does it feel?" Victor thought about that for a moment. He said, "Like I'm building something with my hands for the first time, instead of acquiring things with other people's." Father Amadeo said, "That's the hardest kind of building." Victor said, "Yes, but it stays up." He shook the priest's hand at the door and stepped back out into the winter afternoon. Stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cold. He thought about Paloma asking if he was happy, about Lucia saying, "Let him in," about Elena in grass-stained clothes earning a qualified 4-year-old's approval, about Marisa's face at that bench in October, the color leaving it, the steadiness coming back, the exactness with which she'd said, "Because I knew what your world was." He thought about what it had taken for her to do what she had done. 4 years of carrying alone what most people struggle to carry with help. He'd told her once, about 8 months after the park, that he was sorry she'd felt she had to do it by herself. She'd said, "I didn't feel like I had to. I chose to." Guess there's a difference. He had been thinking about that difference ever since. There's a version of this story that ends neatly, where everything fractured gets wrapped back up into something presentable. This isn't that version. The real version is slower and messier, and it doesn't have a final scene. It has a phone call on a Tuesday, a Saturday visit, a birthday cake shaped like a long-necked dinosaur, a co-parenting conversation that goes well, and one that doesn't, and then another chance the following week. A degree finished at night while 3 small people sleep in the next room. A man learning late what it actually means to be present without conditions. These are the real materials. They're not cinematic, but they hold. What does a story like this leave you with? I think it depends on where you are when you hear it. Maybe it asks you to look at the silences in your own life, the things you've been carrying alone because you told yourself silence is safer, without ever really asking if the thing you're protecting is safe in silence or just hidden there. Maybe it's a reminder that the moment when everything changes doesn't always arrive as a confrontation or a crisis or any of the things you've quietly braced for. Sometimes it arrives as 3 small children in yellow rain boots, sitting in October sunlight, completely unaware of what they mean. And maybe, if you're in the middle of something hard right now, it's a reminder that it is not too late to build something that holds. The building is difficult. It takes honesty and patience, and the specific kind of courage that only shows up when a person has run out of reasons to wait any longer. Victor Caruso, at 49, was building. Marisa Vega, at 33, was finishing something she'd started at 19 and raising 3 extraordinary girls. Their father's eyes, their mother's spine, and the particular stubbornness of people who came into the world together, early and small and furious, and found their way through. Elena was there. Carmen was there. And in a park in Queens on a Saturday morning in May, 3 4-year-olds in green wellies, they had graduated from yellow, were explaining, with complete authority, the superiority of the long-necked dinosaur to a man in a charcoal coat who had already lost that argument before it started. He was outvoted. He was also, for the first time in a very long time, exactly where he was supposed to be. If something in this story stayed with you, I just want to ask you one thing before you go. Is there a door in your life that you've been keeping closed, not because you've forgotten it's there, but because you've decided, for now, that you'd rather not know what's on the other side? Maybe today is the day you find out. Leave me a comment. Tell me what you think. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you want to stay with stories like this one, about people at crossroads, paying the real cost of their choices, building things that hold, the next one is already waiting. Click subscribe. We'll be right here.